Alright, time to make another video. Today we shall make a video on why corruption is inherently tied to bureaucracy. Now, when you think of bureaucracy, you think of managers, those who do things for the state. And yes, that is their main job. A bureaucrat's the dude who sits behind a desk and whatever they're doing is some way related to the administration of the state. Maybe he's a clerk making sure everything's organized. Maybe he's apparently tiny, as I drew this guy way too small, and I gave him legs when it should be under the table. But regardless, maybe they're managing papers, maybe they're ensuring that benefits get through, whatever. A bureaucrat is the person who is the middle manager, making sure everything goes smoothly. Why then is it that we notice, for example, the PRC, which, forgive me while I draw horrible China, or rather Chinese mainland, but anyways, why is it that corruption, for example, is such a big problem there? I mean, it's not like they are, taking a bunch of bribes like the US does, or at least they don't have lobbyists, that should be specified. And even over here in their special regions of Tibet and Xinjiang, which they administer on a somewhat separate basis, there's still corruption. Why is it? Because when a lot of us think of corruption, especially in the US, we think of lobbyists and private interests, but for the PRC and its Communist Party, stuck here in Peking, what we instead see is a lot of corruption, despite, let's face it, private industry in there is basically entirely managed with the state's say-so. And so, why do we see such corruption? The same thing's true in Vietnam. In fact, in recent years, Vietnam was going through great efforts to purge a lot of its corrupt officials because of that. And again, horrible Vietnam, but whatever. Why is Hanoi's government dealing with the same? And we see it again and again and again in a lot of corrupt states. They have a large bureaucratic apparatus. They manage a lot of things for the state. So why is corruption high then? Because a lot of people, especially in the United States and Europe and the West, when we think of corruption, we think of private interests. So why is it that corruption is so common here when private interests have largely taken a back seat? Well, there's a few reasons. 1. Cost. I want you to think about the cost of bureaucracy. Let's say your state has budgeted $400 billion to manage its internal affairs. Relatively small for countries especially as big as this, but let's say $400 billion, okay? And it costs $80 billion to purchase the necessary supplies to pay, to actually do the things, get the desks, get the papers, basically everything that's needed to annually keep up the administration, right? Well, that $320 billion has to be split through every employee. And while sure, they may not all get the same, you can see where this gets troublesome when, for example, let's say you hire 100,000 employees, right? So, how much does each get paid? I'll let you figure that one out. I'm going to get a calculator for the sake of ease because I just don't want to make a mistake here. Right, I got the calculator, and the average amount paid is about 3.2 million, more or less, which is not a bad payday. I mean, for a lot of people, that's a pretty decent salary, especially if that's the annual budget. Well, here's the problem. What happens if instead of 100,000, scratch that, it's 1 million? well, you can quickly see how this is going. That becomes 320,000. And if it increases further, say 10 million, then it becomes 32,000. Now, admittedly, 10 million civil service employees is a bit ridiculous for a smaller government, but you can definitely see where things are starting to head. Even if we cut that in half to 5 million, which with a government that scales over such a large region like the PRC does, is reasonable, that's 72,000. Sorry, not 72, 74,000. Regardless, that is a massive, massive problem. Because the bigger a bureaucracy gets, the more all that money that you raise to pay for it has to be split up and spread out among the many different people in the organization. And so that creates a problem. If this little dude here is getting paid, say, 40,000, and your average living expenses are 50,000, well, then he's incentivized to essentially use his little job here to ask for money. In fact, that is a very common thing to do, especially in countries where they don't pay their bureaucrats as much. Corruption becomes an inherent feature in order for these people to live, and so naturally it becomes ingrained in the bureaucracy, and thus government monies are wasted where they shouldn't be to sustain something that is, in all honesty, a very big waste of money. So that's one reason. The other is, of course, favoritism. How do you keep different departments loyal, especially when the bureaucracy is quite large? Well, you make sure people that are friends of yours get into those positions. Think about it. If you want to run all of Vietnam, you naturally need a lot of people. And with that, you also need to make sure that those people are loyalists. Well, if you put someone in charge because they're a favorite, that incentivizes them to do the same, since without merit for their people to respect, and especially if people know that they're only picked due to their relationship with you, they need loyalists of their own, or else they're going to get replaced. So they put their own loyalists in charge of people below them, and so on, and so on, and so on. Some level of loyalism is necessary, or rather loyalty is the proper word, in order to just make sure a government functions. But the larger the bureaucracy is, the more and more that favoritism shines through. There's also just general risk percentage. Let's think about it as if there's a bunch of people holding a box, right? Okay. So imagine there's this box, and it has to go through several people's hands before it gets to the people it's destined to. Well, if it only goes through 3 hands, and each hand has a 10% chance of that person losing the item, well then, that's a relatively small chance. 0.1 over 3 chances. And it only has to hit once, of course. Then it's just gone. Now I could show you the exact numbers, but that's really not necessary. To get the point across, 10 out of 11. Sorry. 10 out of 100. 20 out of 1,000. 30 out of 10,000, I think. Let's say that's accurate. Probably higher, probably lower. It's probably different, regardless. But as you expand it out to more and more hands, until now you're at 7, guess what? That 10% chance just keeps repeating. And so what ends up happening is you have more and more chances to lose the box. It's the same with government funds. The more and more people you pass it through, the more likely one person is to say, I'm just going to scare him a little off the top. And so that inherently creates a situation that encourages the loss of government revenue. And needless to say, you want it to get to that end person, because guess who that end person usually is? It's an important corporation, or it's the people. Corporations, you want on side for the obvious reason of you still need to fund things and have an economy. People, obvious that the people, they're kind of required to have an economy as well, but also to function as a state. A state cannot function without people. A state without people does not exist. I mean, someone could try, doesn't mean they'd succeed. And so, what you see is just risk inherently incrementally growing as you add more people. Because remember, for this box to be lost, only one of these needs to have a success. Only one needs to go, you know what? I'm going to take this box, going to sell it, and then I'm going to use the money to help myself and my family. Or my friends, whoever they decide to give it to. Maybe they keep it all. Regardless. That's part of it. The other part is just bloat. Specifically, overextension. The larger an entity is, the harder it is to manage because it becomes more unruly. It's easier to get things lost in the piles and piles of things you have to do, people on payroll, things you have to manage. That's just reality. And so, as bureaucracy expands, there's an overextension of it. You have people who think, I'm just one guy in a department of several 100,000. They won't notice if I skim a little off the top here. They won't notice if a few things go missing under my watch. And that becomes a problem. Because as things get bloated, not only are you relying on less and less skilled people, because unless you have a backup of people that are trained and ready to enter the workforce, you're likely going to be relying on green people who need training. You may not be relying as much on merit, especially if you expand more rapidly than your education can provide. And also, you're dealing with people who not only are new to the job, likely have political connections that make it even easier to take stuff without worry. Why? Well, because it's easy ways to maintain power if you're an older party member, is just to say, hey, new guy, help me, I'll help you keep your job. Needless to say, that it incentivizes corruption. Corruption is common in more bureaucratic states, not because bureaucracy is inherently corrupting, though, to be fair, bureaucracy does incentivize a lot of middle management, but rather, it's because the more you expand, the less risk there is for anyone taking a slice of the pie, or the more necessity there is in doing so. Again, if your paycheck isn't enough to cover living expenses, you're gonna want to do what you can to make up the difference. Of course, there are those who just want to take stuff. That will always be the case. But the thing is, this applies to the West too. I'm just gonna write US because, as you can see, not good at drawing countries. But anyways, let's go to the US. Why are lobbyists so powerful? Well, it's because of government bureaucracy. Think about it when you really understand what a lobbyist does. They pay the government to regulate in their favor. If the government couldn't pick sides, if it couldn't say, this is what's going to happen, no one would pay them to do so. Because, well, if the government can't, well then, paying the government to do anything means nothing. Now, some may say, well, why don't we just sponsor a coup and overthrow the government, and then the new government will do it for us. but that's largely unlikely to actually occur. In fact, the US is rather known for its large military, so good luck getting mercenaries to be able to do that. And the US military is not known for liking lobbyists either, because guess what? Those lobbyists are the same people who make their guns expensive. In fact, if you want to see what lobbyists really shine in making the taxpayer just lose a bunch of money, look into our military spending and you'll realize a lot of the things the government spends its money on for the military is way overpriced. That $800 billion or $1 trillion, whatever it is now, I believe they raised it, that amount of money, a decent chunk of it is straight up just extra money the government's paying because lobbyists know how to make the government pay out its ears just to have what they need to run. And so these lobbyists are firmly tied to the bureaucracy. Yes, the corporations hire the lobbyists. I won't deny that, nor would it be wise to. But the problem is not the corporations necessarily. Corporations are playing the game like anyone else would. In fact, we see a lot of non-for-profits also lobbying. So it's clearly more than just, oh, this company wants regulations here. And I know a lot of people get angry when, for example, Israel or Ukraine lobby to us, but what do you expect? That's countries playing country. Welcome to the game. But the reason they care is the same reason the corporations care. The government, in the case of corporations, the bureaucracy, in the case of foreign nations, it's usually the military and diplomatic corps. The bureaucracy for the corporations, and those other two for foreign states, are only cared about because the government can do something. The government can say, hey, Israel, Palestine, let's negotiate, end this war. Or they can say, by the way, Israel takes it all. They care about Ukraine, and vice versa, because the United States government can approve sending Ukraine more guns and ammunition and money. And the corporations care because it allows them to pass regulations and law in their favor. And the lobbyists don't like no regulation. They don't like the government to pull out. What they want is more regulation, but with a catch. They want loopholes. Because yes, for a large corporation, more regulation is actually beneficial because it eliminates a lot of their smaller competitors. But you know what's even better than eliminating a competition? Eliminating competition and not having to pay for all the new regulations. That's the best situation for them. So they want the regulation. They just want to make sure they're not hurt by it. And so then they do it. Naturally, less competition arises. These companies get richer. And so they fund more lobbyists. And guess who they again appeal to? The bureaucrats. The legislators. What they want more than anything is for the bureaucracy to expand because the people most likely to get contracts are the people who lobby. And they're the lobbyists. That means they get to keep their jobs. And so what ends up happening is all of these things are true for the US and other Western countries as well. And all other countries, really. Just to different extents. So while these guys may feel it harder because, well, the bureaucracies are bigger, and so naturally you're going to have more corruption, just as a general rule. What the Western world is currently dealing with is a similar problem, where the bureaucracy is encouraging that same expansion and that same corruption as a result. So what ends up happening is we blame the... Sorry, how should I phrase this? We blame the corporations and the lobbyists for problems caused by bureaucracy and giving permission to the government to essentially pass laws in favor of certain corporations. If the government was neutral in the economy, they would not be lobbying. If we regulated them, they'd still find a way. We see this with Rome, we see this with China, both states that claim they're China, and we see this with other countries besides them. You can regulate them all you want. You're still going to have interest groups. You're still going to have people given privileges. They'll be more secretive about it, sure, but they're still going to do it. And so the lobbying still occurs. The bureaucracy is still used to fuel those interests. More regulations and loopholes are added. Less competition arises. And thus you get a consolidation. And so the lobbying expands. Essentially, it is the bureaucracy that is causing the lobbying, because the bureaucracy is what allows the lobbyists to actually be effective. Think about it. If you're a farmer and you want to get more subsidies, best way to do is find a lobbying group that supports that position and say, hey, we want the USDA to continue subsidizing ourselves so that we can grow more crops. Now, whether you want to do that for moral reasons, like I actually want to grow more crops and expand my business, or you just want to kick back from the government, regardless of the reasoning, the same principle applies. By relying on the government and its bureaucracy, you naturally incentivize corruption. Because what that lobbyist can then go around and do is say, hey, tell you what, I'll push for this. In exchange, I'll work with that dude over there, and we'll make an agreement that satisfies everyone. All while working with the senators, giving them benefits, rewards, and all sorts of things for voting. And that cooperation, often between lobbyists in the situation, will lead to more lobbying, more corruption, so on and so forth. Because again, so long as the bureaucracy allows for more regulation, you will naturally see more regulation going into the system. And there's less competition, and from there, more lobbying and wealthier companies. And that's not a good thing. Sure, wealthier companies is nice in theory, but when it's again through less competition, we don't actually win. The people don't win in that situation. The ones who win are the shareholders. And last time I checked, most of us aren't shareholders in the companies lobbying. Except maybe Starbucks and a few others, but most aren't. And we're definitely not holding shares in all of them. But we all get impacted from the less competition. And so the best way to fix this isn't to abandon bureaucracy. It's still needed so long as we have a state. Until the ANCAP somehow find a way to completely abolish all states and replace them with private cities without bureaucracy, we're not going to see a stateless world. And with states, you need some level of administration, thus bureaucracy is necessarily required. But that said, it's best to minimize it to the most efficient point you can. Because the government runs like a monopoly. The Gov has sole authority over certain aspects. So, for example, the military. Obvious example. If you have a military force in the territory under a government, fair shot they're going to demand it gone. That's just reality. Unless they're hiring it out, they don't want you there if you aren't one of their soldiers. That's an obvious example of government monopoly. With a lot of states who have regulations over healthcare or a national healthcare service, what you often see is the government basically taking that monopoly on healthcare. Another classic is the DMV for the US. The government basically holds a monopoly over the DMV and the things it does. Well, guess what? Because it's a monopoly in those situations, it is naturally more inefficient. So what we should strive to do is reduce the bureaucracy. See if we can privatize certain things, or take what we do have that's monopolized and refine it, specifically the bureaucracy, so that it runs as efficiently as a corporation. At the very least, reducing a lot of the bloat, because the more bloat there is, the more of these chances there are. Anyways, that'll be all for today. Thank you very much for watching.